You're not going to believe what happened to my wife at a local gas station. It started off like any other day, just a quick stop to fill up the tank. But what should have been a normal moment turned into something unbelievable. My wife, kind and quiet woman who minds her own business, was just paying for gas when a woman stormed up out of nowhere. This wasn't just any stranger. This was what people often refer to as a Karen. And she wasn't just rude. She was loud, aggressive, and clearly had a problem with my wife from the moment she saw her. At first, it was small, just side-eyeing and muttering under her breath. But it didn't take long before this woman took things to the next level. She accused my wife of trying to steal her gas, even though my wife was standing at her own pump with her own receipt in hand. The Karen started shouting, demanding that my wife pay for her gas, to claiming the station had made a mistake and my wife needed to do the right thing. And then, in a moment that shocked everyone watching, she pulled out her phone and called 911. Yes, she actually called the police on my wife for buying her own gas. The craziest part, she started twisting the story right there on the call, saying my wife was being hostile and trying to run off without paying. People nearby started recording. You could hear the tension. My wife was calm but shaken, not wanting any trouble but refusing to be bullied. The manager came outside. The sirens weren't far behind. What happened next completely flipped the situation upside down. You won't believe how the cops reacted when they arrived. Stick around, because this story is far from over. As the sirens got closer, more people started gathering around. Some were just curious. Others were clearly uncomfortable with what was happening. My wife stood near the pump, holding her receipt, trying to explain herself calmly. But this Karen wasn't letting up. She kept yelling that my wife had somehow manipulated the system and that she had proof her gas was missing. But when asked what proof she had, she just kept repeating, "I know what I saw." The gas station clerk, a younger guy in his early 20s, stepped outside looking nervous. He confirmed that my wife had paid for her gas at the counter, showed the transaction log, and even pointed to the surveillance camera above the pump. Still, the woman refused to listen. She insisted the cameras were probably broken and accused the clerk of covering for my wife. It was like no amount of logic mattered. That's when things got even more uncomfortable. The Karen started asking my wife where she was from and if English was her first language, saying she must not understand how things work here. That line changed the energy. A few bystanders looked visibly upset but weren't sure if they should step in. My wife stayed composed, clearly trying not to let this woman get to her. She just kept holding her ground, not yelling, not backing down either. At this point, the police had pulled into the lot. 2 officers stepped out and were clearly unsure what kind of situation they were walking into. The Karen immediately rushed over to them, pointing at my wife and saying, "That's her. That's the one I told you about. She tried to take off with my gas." The officers glanced at each other, then over at my wife, who stood quietly by the pump, still holding her receipt. That's when one of the cops slowly started walking toward her. What happened next? No one saw coming. The officer approached my wife slowly, keeping a neutral tone, but you could tell he was trying to read the situation. Before he even said a word, the Karen cut in again, loudly demanding that my wife be arrested and made to pay for her stolen gas. She kept saying things like, "People like her always think they can get away with anything, and I've lived in this neighborhood for 20 years. I know when something's off." Her voice was sharp and full of fake confidence, like she truly believed just being loud would make her right. The officer turned to the clerk and asked for a quick rundown. The clerk, still visibly nervous, handed over the receipt and pointed again to the camera. He even explained the timeline, how my wife had paid, pumped, and stood around calmly the entire time. The officer nodded, but didn't say much. Meanwhile, My wife quietly explained her side too, staying respectful but firm. She told him everything, start to finish, never raising her voice. And still, the Karen wouldn't stop circling like a shark, throwing in comments like she's lying. Or, check her car. I bet she has something to hide. One woman who had been standing near the pump walked over to the second officer and said, "I saw the whole thing. That woman's been harassing her since she got here." That started a ripple. Others in the crowd nodded or spoke up. A man in a truck even said, "I recorded part of it if you want to see." But even with people speaking up, the Karen doubled down, insisting they were all confused or misled. She even tried to accuse the witnesses of being part of some plan, which only made things more tense. That's when one of the officers said they needed to check the security footage. As they walked into the station, the Karen suddenly followed, still ranting, while my wife stood outside with me, now by her side. We locked eyes, and, even though we hadn't said a word, we both knew this wasn't just about gas anymore. Inside the gas station, the tension was thick. Through the glass windows, we could see the officers talking to the clerk, while the Karen hovered right behind them, still throwing out accusations. Her body language was wild, hands flying, face red, pacing like she was the one under attack. My wife stayed outside with me, silent but clearly shaken. Her hands were clenched, and her eyes kept darting to the door like she was bracing for whatever might come next. It wasn't just about being right anymore, it felt personal. More people had gathered by now. Some were talking quietly among themselves, others just watching. A few folks who had witnessed everything pulled out their phones to show the second officer their recordings. One video clearly caught the Karen yelling first, calling my wife suspicious, and claiming she didn't look like she belonged here. The officer nodded but didn't say much, just kept collecting information like he was piecing together a puzzle. Then, out of nowhere, the Karen stormed back outside. Her voice was louder than ever, and she was practically yelling at the officer. Behind her, "This is taking too long. She's clearly guilty," she snapped, pointing at my wife again. "Why aren't you doing anything?" She could have driven off by now if I hadn't stopped her. The officer tried calming her down, but she wasn't having it. She looked at my wife and then at me and said, "This is exactly what's wrong these days. People think they can take advantage and get away with it because no one wants to confront them." The crowd reacted. You could feel the shift. People were no longer just observing. They were uncomfortable. A man muttered, "That's enough." A woman near the pump whispered to her daughter, "Don't ever act like that." Just then, the door of the gas station opened again. The officer who had been inside stepped out, holding something in his hand. Everyone's eyes locked on him. The Karen stood tall, like she thought she'd just won something. My wife didn't move. She just waited. Everything was about to change. The officer stepped forward slowly, holding a printed screenshot from the gas station's security footage. He didn't say anything at first. The silence was thick. The Karen leaned in, smirking like she was about to be proven right. But as he lifted the paper and showed it to her, that smirk slowly faded. "Ma'am," the officer said calmly, "this is you at Pump 6. Your car was never even activated. You never paid for gas." He paused. "You pulled in, argued with the clerk, and walked out without completing your payment. The system shows a canceled transaction on your card." The Karen's expression twisted, first into confusion, then denial. "That can't be right," she said, voice cracking. "The machine must have messed up. She still needs to pay. It's not fair if I lost money." Her voice got sharper again, but something in her tone had changed, like even she knew the lie was slipping. The officer didn't raise his voice. "You never pumped a drop of gas. Your tank is still low." The footage shows you yelling at the clerk before storming out and approaching this woman. He gestured toward my wife. Meanwhile, she paid in full, pumped her gas, and waited here the whole time. Multiple witnesses confirm this. For a second, everyone stood frozen. But before the officer could continue, the Karen blurted, "She distracted me. She pulled in right next to me and messed with my focus. She probably planned this." That's when another twist came out of nowhere. The man who had earlier offered to show his recording suddenly spoke up again. "I didn't want to say this, but I saw her try to stick her card into the wrong pump twice. She wasn't paying attention. She thought she paid, but never followed." The officer glanced at him and nodded. "We've got that too." Karen's face went pale. But instead of calming down, she took a step back and shouted, "This is discrimination. I'm the one being targeted here." And just like that, the situation got even more intense. Now it wasn't just about gas or false accusations. Karen was flipping the narrative again, and everyone was watching to see what the officers would do next. The moment Karen screamed about being targeted, the entire parking lot seemed to freeze. Her voice echoed, but this time, no one backed her up. Even those who had been quiet before were now clearly fed up. One woman in the crowd spoke out, "You called 911 on someone who did nothing wrong, and now you're playing the victim." Another man added, "You tried to blame her for your own mistake. That's not right." The officers kept calm, but their posture shifted. One of them stepped forward and said firmly, "Ma'am, based on the evidence, we've reviewed witness statements, security footage, and transaction records. It's clear that you falsely accused this woman of theft and wasted emergency resources."
Aaron's
face turned red, her eyes darting everywhere. "Atinna, I really thought she," but the officer cut her off gently. "Intent or not, you called the police under false pretenses. You made serious accusations, and this could have gone very differently. You need to understand how serious this is." Wife finally spoke up. Her voice was steady but emotional. "You humiliated me in public. You made me feel unsafe for simply getting gas." Her words hung in the air. Everyone heard the pain behind them. The officer turned to Karen again and said, "You're not under arrest, but we are filing a formal incident report. You may be contacted further, depending on what the station wants to do." Karen didn't say a word. She just stood there, stunned, like her world had suddenly flipped as things started to settle. And the officers wrapped up. Something unexpected happened. The clerk came out from behind the counter, handed my wife a gift card, and said softly, "I'm really sorry this happened to you. This shouldn't have been your experience today." It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it meant everything. And just as we were about to leave, Karen's own car alarm went off loud and sudden. She turned, startled, realizing she'd left her keys inside with the engine running the entire time. The crowd couldn't help but react. Some chuckled. Others shook their heads. It was like the story had one last twist to remind everyone what happens when you let bias and ego take the wheel, as the car alarm kept blaring. Karen fumbled with the door, realizing she had locked herself out. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same person who had spent so much energy accusing someone else of wrongdoing now stood helpless, red-faced, and exposed. The officer quietly called roadside assistance on her behalf, and without saying another word, Karen sat on the curb, arms crossed, avoiding everyone's eyes. We finally got back in our car. My wife took a deep breath, her hands still slightly trembling. "I didn't expect to need strength just to get gas today," she said softly. I reached over and held her hand. "You stood up with grace," I told her, and she did. She never raised her voice. She never let the chaos shake her dignity as we pulled out of the station. We waved to the people who had supported her, those strangers who had spoken up when it mattered. It reminded us that even when things get ugly, there are always good people around willing to do the right thing. Later that day, reports a gas station manager called and apologized again, saying they'd be reviewing their response process and keeping the footage in case legal action followed. The officers also mentioned in their report that the 911 call had been misused, which could result in a citation. Whether or not that happens, one thing is clear. Truth came to light, and character showed up when it counted. This wasn't just about gas or a false accusation. It was about how quick people are to judge how dangerous assumptions can be, and how staying calm in the face of unfairness takes real strength. So if there's anything to take away from this story, it's this: stand your ground, know your worth, and never let someone else's ignorance dim your light.